Things are never quite what they seem. We think we understand the world around us, but we really only see the outside, what it seems to be. I used to be just like you. I believed in humanity, the newspapers, soap commercials, politics, and history books. But one day, the world kicks you in the teeth, and you don't have any choice but to see things the way they really are. My name is Lucas Kane. My story is the one where an ordinary guy has something extraordinary happen to him.
From its powerful opening moments to its questionable endings, Fahrenheit is one unique beast of a game. Whether you love it or hate it, this is an experience you won't soon forget, and trust me, you will either love it or hate it. There is no in-between with this game. Fahrenheit, also known as Indigo Prophecy, was the first game to adopt Quantic Dream's iconic and perhaps even infamous style of gameplay, and it is here that we will start our first Stiles Series Synopsis. Before we get too far into things, I feel it is important to note that I'm playing the PC Remastered version of the game, and when putting this next to the original version, I can barely tell the difference. This game is a pathetic excuse of a remaster, and frankly, the company who did it, these guys, should be ashamed. The only arguably large improvements the remaster has over the original is the higher resolution and the controller support. The latter actually being an important inclusion as this game was designed with a controller in mind. If we want to compare the graphics to those at the time of the game's initial release, it is decent, I guess. There's a problem inherent with games striving for realism, however, and that problem is that pushing for realism makes unnatural movements all the more distracting. Those familiar with the concept of the uncanny valley will know exactly what I'm talking about. Fahrenheit doesn't even attempt proper limb syncing, and the facial animations are almost laughable at times. The game hides a lot of its animations so that they don't have to exist at all. For example, every single time a character changes their clothes, it is blocked by a piece of furniture, or in this case, a computer monitor. And this doesn't just happen to block out nudity either, as the simple act of taking off a jacket is removed from view. Besides, this title has no qualms with nudity, but more on that bit later. The amount of detail put into small objects littered throughout the game is contrasted heavily by the rather uninteresting textures of larger buildings and outdoor areas that feel so barren that they almost feel unfinished. Not to bash this game too hard for its graphical design, but this game came out in 2005, the same year that brought us Resident Evil 4 and God of War, both of which I specifically chose as comparisons because they looked a lot better at the time and also both have HD remasters that weren't completely half-assed. I got used to the graphics eventually, and they're far from the most important part of the experience, but given that Quantic Dream games are known for pushing realism boundaries in their future titles, it is a shock that this title turned out to be so ugly, especially when the goal was to create a cinematic experience. I have the feeling I'm going to get some major flack for bashing a 10-year-old game's graphics, and it's not generally something you even pay this much attention to, but Fahrenheit is a game based solely around its storytelling, and you do as much watching as playing, so making the title graphically appealing would have been an arguably important thing to focus on. At least I can praise use of color and lighting for perfectly setting the game's tone in its first half, so it wasn't a complete failure. The game's soundtrack is similarly good at setting the game's mood, though it generally sticks to a thriller-like ambiance, which, given the game's narrative, is as it should be. The game is also filled with a few licensed tracks that help bring the world to life. That being said, however, I couldn't remember a melody to any of the original compositions if you put a gun to my head. The soundtrack just isn't memorable, but given how the game wanted to mimic a certain film style, I suppose it worked out in the long run. The one point of the sound design that a lot of work was clearly poured into was the voice acting, and it's here where I feel the game is most polished. There were a few moments where I felt the acting was a bit stiff and unnatural, but upon further examination, it very much felt like the script is what caused the issues, not the actors themselves.
I had some shit on my mind this morning. I knew Samantha was depressed, but I didn't know what I could really do about it. I was happy to be back in here. Man, I love that smell of old leather and sweat. Maybe I could just forget about everything for an hour and just get in a good workout with Carla.
As far back as I can remember, I've been frightened by small spaces. Whenever I'm in a small, confined place, I start to panic. I've trouble breathing, and I need to get out right away. Yeah, you've heard the name. Claustrophobia.
I don't care how good of an actor you are, with material as melodramatic as that, it is hard to turn into solid performance. The developers should be proud of the performers they cast for this game, as they're the only thing that keeps the presentation from falling completely into mediocrity. Now, this is where things get interesting. Talking about Fahrenheit as a game, or any David Cage title for that matter, always leads to a discussion that I find incredibly interesting. That question being, what constitutes a game? The work of David Cage is often referred to as being an interactive film, even by the creator himself, and that has led to a lot of people writing off his titles as not being games at all. So what is a game then? While it is a rare question in the AAA market, it is a question often posed when visual novels are brought up. I actually used to argue that visual novels were not video games, and that they were, in fact, a medium all their own that still deserved its own level of respect. But as I've thought about it further, I don't think the question should be what is a game, but does it matter? Why does the label matter? And even more than that, why should we be limiting ourselves to what games are and what they aren't? If you are watching this, and I assume you enjoy video games in at least some capacity, and if that's the case, you likely don't limit yourself to just one genre. Video games have the luxury of being rather variant in what is produced, with the key overarching element that mediums such as books, music, and movies lack being interactivity. Why should we limit our medium to a more structured and less creative scope by writing off other genres when we can have them all? Admitting that visual novels are video games does not hurt or alter the other genres we enjoy, it simply broadens our horizons. You may not be a fan of a single genre, and no one is forcing you to play said genre, so its existence in no way affects the people with a negative output. But it does affect those who like more variety by providing them with a different type of experience that they can't get elsewhere. If we truly wanted to draw lines in the sand, we wouldn't have such cult hits as Papers, Please or Journey. I know this was a bit long-winded and soapboxy, and I apologize for that, but I feel it was important to establish this mindset before entering into what will be a rather short discussion of Fahrenheit's gameplay, because frankly there isn't a lot to talk about, but I appreciated the company's willingness to experiment anyway. At its core, Fahrenheit is an evolution of the adventure game genre, taking games like Monkey Island, Grim Fandango, etc., and making enough changes to make it feel fresh and new, while also getting rid of the Sierra logic that these old titles were infamous for. I'm sure you can tell from the footage already shown that this game looks fairly similar in places to the now famous Telltale Games formula. It is impossible to play this game and not see the heavy inspiration the Walking Dead titles took from it, and considering that series' popularity, I feel that fans of Telltale owe at least a little thanks to Quantic Dream for developing said formula in the first place. The majority of the gameplay is a rather slow and thorough search of every area you come across, thus pointing back to its adventure game roots. Whether you are looking for clues or simply searching for a means of lowering your character's stress level, the vast majority of the game is spent interacting with every object in the environment that the game will let you touch. While that may sound boring on the surface, I found it to be an entertaining experience, mostly due to the vast amount of objects that the game does let you interact with, and every one has some sort of use. Something as simple as logging onto a computer, which does very little in terms of advancing the game, can give you insight into the world as a whole, filling in gaps in the plot that would otherwise feel jarring if you weren't paying enough attention. The previously mentioned stress level is a constant factor in the game as well. The tutorial states that if your character reaches too low of a mental state, they could eventually commit suicide, and while I never saw that action occur or even know if it is possible, it is a damn good motivator, and the times when my meter did get too low really had me scrambling for a quick means to fix the issue. In addition to interacting with the environment, I particularly enjoy how dialogue was handled in this game, giving you only a short time period to choose an appropriate response to any given situation. Yet another idea ripped verbatim for use in Telltale's games. Now of course there are problems here. The one-word prompts don't always give a good indication of tone or context, but given the game's rather forgiving checkpoint system, you can always go back and choose different decisions if you don't like the outcomes you got the first time. Those decisions, however, often have very little impact on the game itself. Fahrenheit is a linear affair, and almost every choice you make will be arbitrary, but there are still choices that form your own narrative. Due to technical hiccups during my recording that had me replaying the first quarter of the game 5 times, I was able to discover how much detail really was put into the game. In fact, even on my 5th playthrough of that section, when I thought I had everything down to a science, I was still discovering new interactive objects and slightly altered effects to my sanity meter. That is where I think Fahrenheit actually succeeds. The majority of the story isn't going to change, but there's enough there to give players their own unique experience. And now for the elephant in the room. When you're not spending your time scavenging or making dialogue choices, the main gameplay is focused around quick-time events that resemble a game of Simon. My complaints about the way the system is handled have very little to do with the QuickTime events themselves, though they do move a bit too fast at times to be feasibly responded to, but with the way they are presented. The QuickTime event icons are placed in the center of the screen and move so quickly that it's nearly impossible to focus on the action happening in the background, kinda defeating the purpose of the game's cinematic design. Not to mention, these QuickTime event sequences have a habit of sticking around for far longer than is necessary or fun, creating actual tests of endurance as you proceed. In addition to the standard QuickTime event segments, the game has a few other set pieces that, while not fully developed, I still enjoyed. There are 3 in particular that I remember, one being a stealth segment in a flashback, another being a first-person segment where you shoot on a range, and a third being a first-person puzzle section in a dark basement-type area where you have to control your breathing while trying to solve a few puzzles. I found the last one particularly intriguing, and it took a bit of multitasking, and I found it to be one of the most memorable moments in the game. I enjoyed these brief cutaways from the main gameplay, and I was glad to see them experiment the way they did. All these things being taken into consideration, this is not a game that I feel has any replay value at all. I argued in a previously written review that all you have to do to give a game replay value is to make it good, and I still feel that is generally the case. But in the case of Fahrenheit, there just isn't much substance to it. It is an interesting experience, and one that I found worthy of my single playthrough, but the gameplay just isn't enough to make it interesting more than once. And trust me, I know how painful it is given those technical hiccups I mentioned earlier. In this case, it really does become a very, very long film at about 8 hours of runtime, and the story, well, we'll get to the story alright. It's an interesting experience to say the least, but, once was enough. The game begins with our main protagonist, Lucas, as he finds that he has murdered someone against his will and has to hide the body to escape as quickly as possible. I have to admit that this was a really good game opening. It's gripping, induces panic, and leaves you wanting to know what is going on. From there you play as 3 characters, Lucas and 2 detectives, Clara and Tyler, as they work on the case to try and catch Lucas. This creates an extremely interesting balancing act, seeing the story play from both sides. At times, I actually felt conflicted on whose side I was on. I actually had moments where I debated purposefully not finding certain clues as the detectives that I knew I'd left behind as Lucas mere moments before, though in the end I remembered that this is a video game and decided that it would likely reward skillful and thorough play above all else, and that seemed to ring true for the most part. Even so, the story succeeds at remaining masterfully tense and keeping me unaware of what was going to happen next, and I absolutely loved how well it all came together. It was genuinely well crafted. The characters themselves are a mixed bag, with Lucas being the most boring of the bunch despite being the only one in an interesting predicament. I really had no reason to care for him or sympathize with him, and really only enjoyed his section of the story because that is where things got the most strange. After all, he is the one who committed the murder, and he spends the vast majority of his time after this point seeing strange hallucinations and gaining superpowers because... reasons. Clara, on the other hand, is your no-nonsense typical detective, strong-willed and independent. She's the real brains of the detective pair, and I guess the one you are supposed to connect to most. I find it interesting that Clara is the only character that the game allows you to play as in first-person sections of the game, and I'm wondering if this was an actual intentional decision or just something that happened by accident. Not a bad character. At first, anyway. And then there's Tyler. Let's face it, it's almost racially insensitive in how stereotypically he's portrayed. He loves Motown, always has a relaxed demeanor, and, well, I'll just let you see for yourself.
Stand this pain much longer. I think I better let it go. Oh, baby.
So yeah, apparently he has it going on in all the right places. Alright, despite my humorous tone, he's actually my favorite character because of his fun-loving nature and the fact that he provides a drastically needed comic relief for the first half of the game. That and his relationship with his girlfriend Sam leaves him as the only character that feels like they actually have a life outside of work, furthering the realistic feel of the world. The first half of Fahrenheit is a slow and intentional burn that keeps things moving at a very deliberate and gripping pace. It sets the tone perfectly, had me genuinely interested in what was going on, and I really wanted to see how things were going to play out. The second half, on the other hand, well, the second half both begins and can be defined perfectly by this scene here, which, out of context, shouldn't be a spoiler for anyone watching, so I'm just gonna let it play out for you.
Don't move, asshole.
New York police. Don't move.
Did you see what that guy just did? Shit, that's crazy.
There you go. We're going full-on Matrix here. Anyway, I could talk about this game's story for hours, just detailing every moment, but I don't have all day, and I'm sure you don't either. So I'm going to seriously try and sum things up as quickly as possible. I can't discuss this game in any meaningful way without heavy spoilers, so here we go. Just so you know, things get frickin' hilarious from here on out. Are you guys ready for this? Because I don't think you're ready for this. Really, you just... I can't even... Whew. Okay. I'm just gonna say it. So, you end up learning that the possession of Lucas and all the other murderers was done by a 2,000-year-old Mayan oracle who is trying to find the Indigo child, who is a child with a soul of pure light who can be used to give his clan control of the entire world somehow because reasons. And oh my god, this is just scratching the surface of this gold. It turns out that there's a second faction looking for the child, and this faction is, get this, the Internet as an entity. Well, technically the Internet is mentioned, but really it is supposed to be a mass AI in general that is constructed because of the power of the Internet. I guess it works because it's taking a little bit of processing power from every computer connected to the Internet, and oh, who cares? This game certainly doesn't. I'm gonna be honest, this part of the story was spoiled for me before I even started the game, and I actually found the concept interesting. There's actually a scientific hypothesis being argued right now that asks the question of whether or not the internet can be considered an organism. And by the very definition of that word, this is an actual argument, not nearly as crazy as it sounds. I wanted to bring an intelligent discussion into this review and seriously begin to question what constitutes a living thing, but I just can't because this is what the game gives us. Let's not forget to mention that the intentionally slow pace of the first half is thrown completely out the window and replaced with action scene after action scene that rivals the Matrix in their absurdity. Tyler gets all but written out of the story completely when his girlfriend gives him the ultimatum of his job or her. Carla jumps ship and begins helping Lucas rather than hunting him because the plot demands that she like him, and I mean really like him. This romance subplot, like most of the plot points in the second half of the game, comes completely out of nowhere. There's a secret society of homeless people who are actually knowledgeable about these warring factions. There are flashbacks about how Lucas, living on a military base as a child, had him encountering a secret artifact that gave him the ability to have premonitions. But wait, isn't that completely contradictory to the game saying that the premonitions actually come from the Mayan Oracle's possessions? Did they think about this at all or just make it up as they went along? David Cage, you've got some serious explaining to do, man. Seriously though, all of those subplots aside, when you boil the story down to its most basic components, you have a game that went from being an actually compelling murder mystery with some supernatural elements, and turned it into a story about a zombie, a Mayan oracle, and the literal embodiment of the internet having a slap fight over who gets to sacrifice a little girl. Oh yeah, Lucas is a zombie now, by the way. At one point the Mayan actually kills Lucas, and the internet somehow magically brings him back to life because of a literal deus ex machina, I guess? Who fucking cares at this point? This is just glorious. But wait a second, does that mean that the previously mentioned romance involving sex scene was technically a case of necrophilia? My god, guys, I know that might be taking things too far, but I am not making this shit up. It is right there in the game. The game actually makes sure to make him appear dead, and also mentions more than once that his skin is cold and his breath doesn't form clouds in sub-zero temperatures. I mean, technically he can consent, so I guess that would defeat most of the laws regarding this infatuation, but was this really written? This is just all too much for me to handle, so I'm going to move things along now. The game has 3 different endings, each under 3 minutes long and all equally anticlimactic, showing what does or doesn't happen to the world if each of the 3 factions wins. And by that point I was so thoroughly satisfied with the adventure and the hilarity that I just didn't care. You know, Lucas is seeing a lot of crazy shit. This whole story makes way more sense if you just imagine that everything after his initial murder was him dreaming in the loony bin. That or just a really nasty hallucination from some bad shrooms. My god, this game is just a laugh riot. It's an absolutely and astonishingly hilarious tale of bravery, lunacy, romance, murder, and of course the game's most crucial story arc, the basketball. Fahrenheit is just ridiculous. In fact, it is downright stupid, and I genuinely enjoyed it. I can't argue that the story is good in any sense, and yet I felt it was well worth my time to experience it. It goes against every fiber of my being to recommend a game that's fundamental element, the story, is just so batshit insane and poorly written, and yet I have to. I had so much fun playing this game with friends and making fun of the story as it was happening that I would have gladly paid double the asking price to find that amount of genuine entertainment. I guess this can be classified as a guilty pleasure for me. It feels like a schlocky B-movie in its sincerity and campiness, and I honestly feel that you should only invest in this title if you were looking for that kind of entertainment. I hate to say that it's so bad that it's good because it sounds cliche and is a bit of an insult considering how well written and paced the first half of the game was, but that second half switches gears so hard that I just couldn't help myself. Apparently this game was supposed to be episodic in nature and had to be cut down from 12 parts to 1, and I can see it, but it still doesn't excuse the sorry state this game came out in. When the goal of your game is to tell a story, you need to actually tell it competently. Instead, we were given a product full of plot holes, poorly explained motivations, and deus ex machinas that would give M. Night Shyamalan a run for his money. The worst part is that the beginning actually held a great deal of emotional weight and had me fully invested before everything went completely bonkers. Well, that's all I can think to say when it comes to Fahrenheit, also known as Indigo Prophecy. Thank you all for watching. Next time on Stiles Series Synopsis of Quantic Dream, I will be covering Heavy Rain, the title that from the research I've done seems to be the most enjoyed game in the bunch? Maybe? I don't know, it's really hard to tell. Either way, I hope to see you there.